Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that Earthcare should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Hey, Earthkeepers. This, my friends, is the 100th episode of the podcast. In keeping with this landmark episode, we'll be doing something special. We're launching a new Circlewood podcast called Youth in Climate Action. As you might imagine, the podcast will focus on the needs and questions of younger folks about Earth care and the climate future. Importantly, it will also feature young voices and highlight innovative approaches to inspire a new generation of Earth activists and advocates. In this episode of the Earthkeepers podcast, James and I will be in conversation with the two founders of the Youth in Climate Action podcast, Matchell and Kinsley Rawson. James, my brother, as always, it's awesome to be co-hosting with you again. Welcome.
Yeah, it's great to be here, especially on this noteworthy episode.
Yeah, episode 100.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
I think back to our first podcast with a guest, and that was with Tamina Martelli of World Belief, talking about Paradise Parking Lot Gardens.
Yeah, and I just say I have learned a lot over 100 episodes and really appreciate the work that you've done for us to introduce us to creative Earthkeepers around the globe.
Well, I can say that if anyone goes back to listen to those early episodes, they'll see that I've also learned a lot about podcasting. So it's been a steep learning curve, but it's been a lot of fun. James, could you give us some background about our guests today and about the emerging partnership and why it kind of makes sense for us to be talking about a new thing on the 100th episode?
Yeah, this is really exciting to do it on the 100th episode because not only has it given us a chance to look back on what we've been able to do through the Earthkeepers podcast, this is a chance to look forward because our guests today are launching with us a new podcast called Youth in Climate Action. And I could not be more excited about this. It's timely, it's needed, and our guests have a great vision for this. So before we meet them, I will just give a little bit of the backstory about how this came about. So last summer, I had the privilege of being one of the presenters at a week-long workshop at Westmont College down in California called Faith, Climate, and Action. And this workshop gathered college students and faculty members from schools around the country to gather and learn about the climate crisis and explore ways that they could go back to their communities and their churches to raise awareness, to do projects to help find a way to be climate activists in their hometowns and home communities. And it was exciting to see such passion and energy from young people. It was incredibly rich and rewarding to see faculty members helping kind of think through these tough issues and how we might make a difference. And I'm excited to see that one of the projects that came out of that was an idea for this new project with Matchell and Kinsley. So I'm really glad that they're with us and excited to see what they're going to do.
Well, to Matchell and Kinsley, welcome to you both. Perhaps you could give our listeners a sense of your stories and how you came to care about environmental issues. And Matchell, let's start with you.
Forrest, I want to start by thanking yourself and James for having Kinsley and I here on the Earthkeepers podcast this morning. We're so grateful to be partnering with Circlewood, a wonderful organization doing such meaningful work in creation care. I grew up in the Christian faith at a mega church in the suburbs of Southern California, and neither my church nor my community more broadly ever spoke about creation care or climate change. Yet through my family and the church, I was able to be connected to nature throughout my life. I grew up right against what are called the San Gabriel Mountains, and I was able to camp and hike and mountain bike and snowboard in those mountains growing up. Early on, I noticed that it was easier to connect with God and my spiritual life when in those mountains. So even as I grew up and moved to Washington, D.C., and then eventually to downtown Los Angeles, I used time in nature as a way to stay grounded and connected with God. Fast forward to the COVID-19 pandemic years, I decided to go back to school and earn a master's in public administration from the University of Southern California. I worked on research related to sea level rise in Miami-Dade County, Florida, and worked with the State Department on public diplomacy strategies as it related to the Paris Climate Agreement. After completing my master's, I began adjunct teaching in communication at a well-known Christian university here in Los Angeles. In one of my courses, I teach rhetoric, and each student picks a social issue to study and speak on throughout the semester. I use examples related to climate change and creation care in that course, and that's where Kinsley and I first met. Through a gracious gift of the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, Kinsley and I had the opportunity to join dozens of other like-minded Christians from across Christian higher education at the Faith Climate Action Workshop that James mentioned earlier. It was there that I got to meet James, which I'm so grateful for. And this program is also what's funding the first season of our podcast, Youth in Climate Action. It's also there where Kinsley and I learned about the Christian Climate Observers Program, which took us to COP28 in Dubai this past December.
Michael, I just want to affirm all the work that you have done and been doing, and just note how interesting it is that your story about your childhood is so familiar when we're asking Christians about their connection to this. Often it's that they had this immersive experience in the natural world as a child, and yet they were also immersed in church where this was never mentioned. And those two things remain disconnected. And somehow you've been able to keep that thread going, which is wonderful and helpful, I think, to others who might look back on their childhood and see the same kind of pattern. Kinsley, I'm wondering if that was your experience or if there are other ways in which you just came to love and care for the earth and really care about creation care.
Yeah, first I want to say thank you, Michael, for sharing. And thank you to Forrest and James for having Michael and I on today. I would say I definitely had a very similar introduction into creation care and environmental science as a whole. Like Michael, I grew up in the church and grew up going to church every Sunday with my family. And I've never really heard the term creation care or anything about the climate crisis or environmental science in church really at all growing up until I got to Biola, which is the first time I ever heard anything even remotely having to do with the relationship between the environment and faith and how we're called to be stewards of creation. For sure, I grew up having a love of nature, and how I really kind of got thrown into all of this is in my senior year of high school. I decided to take an AP environmental science class just on a whim. Nothing really super interested me yet with that field. But as I took the class, I started to realize how big of an issue this really was. I hadn't grown up hearing about it. I'd heard the terms global warming, but didn't really know that it was such a big issue. And I started questioning why this wasn't something that was being talked about more, why this wasn't something that Christians cared more about. And so as I began my journey into college, I ended up at Biola, not really knowing what I wanted to do, but knowing that I had a passion for environmental science and stewardship. And that's how I ended up meeting Michael, like he said, was through his rhetorical act class. And we had to pick a social issue, and I ended up picking climate change. And that's how Michael discovered that I was interested in that and informed me of the opportunity of the Faith Climate Action Workshop at Westmont. And so I got to go to that this past summer and meet so many students and professors and mentors who shared their love of creation.
Can you say I'm really intrigued by all the times you mentioned opportunities to learn about creation care and environment. When you talk about an AP course in high school in environmental studies, I just get so jealous. Like, if only I had had such resources. So I'm really excited to hear that you have had these opportunities, that you and your peers have opened doors to enter into these issues. You mentioned that it's become more of an interest recently. I'm wondering, when you look at the future, have you got any ideas about the kind of work you might want to do and whether and if it would involve climate change creation care issues?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I actually went into my freshman year unsure of what I wanted to do, but I've always known that I have a love for art and creativity. And so getting involved with creation care and being passionate about the environment threw me off because I was like, wow, this is something else that I'm really passionate about and that I want to be more involved in. And so I wanted to find a way that the two could work together, which is interesting because art and science isn't something that you think, oh yeah, those would pair really well to find a career. I ended up declaring a major this past fall semester. I declared design as my major, and I'm hoping to go into sustainable design. So I'm not really sure specifically what I want to do with that because that's very broad, but I know I didn't want to give up my love for art and creativity because that's something that I've always grown up with and loved. But I also knew that creation care was something that I wanted to do with the rest of my life. So that's the path that I'm planning on going down for now.
You remind me actually of my daughter and her place in life. She's a senior at Seattle Pacific, and she's studying culture and social justice, but then she's got a minor in art. And so somehow she knows that the two will come together. But I love the courage that she and you demonstrate by sort of walking forward without necessarily knowing the career path. I mean, in some ways, it's you all who are going to have to form those paths. I mean, we don't actually know how those things fit together, but clearly art must have something to do with creation. So I love it that you are trying to figure that out and maybe in some ways leading the way for others to follow you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, before we talk about the podcast, which of course is going to reflect a lot of what both of you have said about your commitment to Earthcare, I really want to hear about your recent experiences at the COP28 gathering. Michael, if you could, first of all, tell us what is COP28 and what were some of the main takeaways from your time there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So COP28 itself refers to the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which took place in Dubai from November 30th until December 12th back in 2023. COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and 28 simply refers to this being the 28th conference of those parties. So UN climate change conferences, or COPs, take place every year, and they are the world's only multilateral decision-making forum on climate change. All that means is that it's the only place where over 190 UN member nations come together to talk about this subject, and it includes over 70,000 delegates from all around the world, from people such as the negotiators that represent the member nations to business leaders, young people like Kinsley, climate scientists, indigenous people, journalists, and others who all are invested in this topic of climate change and the outcomes of the conference itself. So as credentialed observers in the Blue Zone, which is what Kinsley and I were at COP28, I was struck by two things in particular. The first is that while tension certainly ran high and there were moments where it was tempting to believe that trying to respond to this climate crisis is pointless, I was constantly awed by the simple fact that 190 nations and over 70,000 people could come together peacefully to talk about anything, let alone this subject. It was overwhelming to be in that space and to feel like I'm a part of history, but it gave me a hope and an energy that's hard to articulate. Second, and this comes from the words of the CCOP program director, Lowell Bliss, I learned an invaluable lesson in the importance of loving my enemies. Martin Luther King Jr. said that we must discover the power of love. And when we discover that, we will be able to make of this old world a new world. We will be able to make people better. Love is the only way. Jesus discovered that. Again, I'm borrowing from Lowell and his wonderfully written essay, but at a COP, the clear and present enemy is the fossil fuel industry. The burning of fossil fuels is the number one driver of the climate crisis that we face. COP28 was presided over by Sultan Al Jaber, who is the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. It had the largest number of registered lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry of any COP before it. So the resistance from our enemy was greater than I think anyone could have anticipated. For the first time in COP history, nation member negotiators were calling for the total phase out of fossil fuels to avoid the worst harms of climate change. To say it was a historic moment would be an understatement, but the industry wasn't going to go down without a fight. Leading into week 2, The Guardian leaked a letter from the Secretary General of OPEC. OPEC, by the way, stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, and it is made up of 20 member nations, making it one of the single most powerful non-government organizations on the planet. In the leaked letter, the Secretary General implored OPEC's member nations to do everything in their power to stop the language of the total phase out of fossil fuels from being included in the final agreement. A couple of days after having gone on the charm offensive, as put by Reuters, OPEC hosted a day with the youth in their conference pavilion within the Blue Zone. Myself and a couple of college students from CCOP that were with me stumbled into a fireside chat that was hosted by the OPEC Secretary General himself, along with his head of administration, Hassan al-Hamadi. Here we were face to face with our so-called enemy. And while they tried rather unsuccessfully to persuade a group of about 12 youths from around the world that OPEC could lead the way in reducing the harms of burning fossil fuels, I was struck by how personable and average these men seemed. One of them even talked about how his daughter was thriving and how he had hopes for her future, even in the midst of the climate crisis. Afterwards, some of us ended up in a heated discussion with Mr. Al-Hamadi about the leaked letter and OPEC's refusal to admit the world needs to phase out fossil fuels. It got so heated that we actually attracted the attention of multiple journalists. At that moment, all I could think about was Lowell talking to us about the importance of loving our enemy. And I kept asking myself, how do I love this man well in this moment while still standing up for the billions of people he's harming? While I'm still pondering that question, what I took away was this. Dozens of countries around the world have grown their economies, moved people out of poverty, and have a real fighting chance for the first time in over 100 years because of the fossil fuel industry. To be honest, the U.S., at least here in Southern California, was in the same boat not that long ago. LA earned its wealth by drilling for oil. The university I teach at was founded by a Christian oil man. And what I realized after that moment is that men like Mr. Al-Hamadi are afraid. They're afraid of what their nations will become without oil. They're as afraid for their children's future as anyone else is. And so why is loving our enemy important in climate action? Well, I'll return to MLK's quote that Loblitz so eloquently used to frame his essay. Jesus showed us that it's the better way to make the world new and to make people better. So as we navigate climate change and the need to phase out fossil fuels, we have to do it in a way that leaves nobody behind. In the same way that we can't leave our brothers and sisters in the sinking Pacific Islands behind, we can't leave the oil man in the deserts of Saudi Arabia behind either. We must love our enemy as we love ourselves.
Michael, what a rich experience there in Dubai that you had. And I'm struck by thinking about how I would feel as I'm just coming from my little community, flying to this big international conference, and then finding yourself kind of in the thick of it with these big global decision makers and having that experience of seeing how powerful and how normal they are and human they are as well, and thinking through what it means to love them. Wow, what a rich experience. And Kinsley, I'm wondering if you felt that same kind of a way about being there. What were the most interesting parts for you?
For me, I definitely felt very overwhelmed and very small when I first got there. Going to Dubai was the first time I had ever been out of the country at all before. So it was a very big step for me, and I was definitely really nervous going into it. And like I mentioned before, I didn't really get involved with climate change or the environmental crisis until pretty recently. So I definitely went into it kind of feeling unqualified and like I wasn't really supposed to be there. I had a little bit of imposter syndrome going into it because I was surrounded by so many world leaders and scientists and other people my age who have been involved with this for so much longer than I have and who are so much more knowledgeable than me. I just remember getting there and my very first feeling that I had, I was just in awe by seeing how many people were there who cared so much about this issue from all over the world, which was so cool to see. As the week went on, like Michael mentioned, one of the big issues of the COP was the phasing out of fossil fuels. And while I was there, I got to see a small gathering protest, if you will, of students and young people who were fighting for the phase out of fossil fuels. I also had the opportunity to speak with a man from Nigeria, and I was just walking around the COP grounds, and I ended up running into him, and we just had a really interesting conversation because I shared with him that I was there as part of the Christian Climate Observers Program, and he was very taken aback by that, and he was like, "Oh, you're a Christian?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "What are you doing here? You're a Christian from America." And I was like, "I'm here because I care about the climate, and I believe that God calls Christians to be stewards of creation and to care about his creation." And we just got into this long discussion because he didn't understand why a Christian would care so much, and he didn't understand that I was there. And so that was also really eye-opening for me, and it just reminded me of why I was at COP in the first place and who I was ultimately there for, which is God. And so that switched my mindset for the rest of my time there, was that I just wanted to remember who I was there to represent, and remember that, yes, I was there to learn and share my love for the environment and my passion about the climate, but that ultimately I was there to share God with others and share who he is. So I would say overall, the biggest takeaways that I had was just seeing how many people cared and just realizing that this is an issue that Christians are 100% called to and should be more involved in, that young people and young Christians especially can get involved, and that it's not too late to get involved. I've only really been a part of this for 2 years, and I already had the opportunity to go to COP. You don't have to be the most knowledgeable person. You don't have to know everything, and you don't have to do all the things. You don't have to recycle and compost and wear all the most sustainable clothing. It's okay to take steps, and it's okay to sometimes feel like an imposter where you are, but just remember that just the fact that you care is such a big deal.
When you got back, were you still hopeful? I'm wondering about your stance at this point on the hope for the American church. Do you think that things could change, especially when we're talking about your generation, right, and their capacity to actually lead the culture? Do you think that's possible, or are you feeling empowered at all around that question?
I feel like that's definitely something that I've found myself struggling with, and it definitely can seem hopeless at times. But I think that upon returning, I've actually been more hopeful, because just the fact that there was an organization specifically for Christians to go to COP, and that this was the first year that COP had a faith pavilion, which was really cool, getting to meet people who were Christians and people from other religions who were there, who cared about the climate and the relationship that the environment and faith have, was really cool. Coming home, I think I was more hopeful, and I was more inspired to share this faith and climate connection with the people in my community and with the students on my campus. And I think that's a big reason why Michael and I have decided to start this podcast, is to share with the young people and with other young Christians that this is something that you can get involved in and something that you should care about. And it's something that Christians are called to. And it's been really cool. Since coming back this semester, I've joined an environmental advocacy club that just got started this year at my school, which is really, really cool, because Biola didn't really have anything like that. And I was kind of struggling with that my Christian-based school didn't really have anything that made it seem like they cared about the environment. And we do have solar panels. The food that we get for our calf is sustainable, and it's from green agriculture, but it's not ever really talked about here. And it's It's been really hard, and I've been struggling with that, but I've realized that this is where I'm supposed to be. That's why I'm here, is to share that with the students and to make it known that this is something that we should be more involved in. And just seeing that there's something like an environmental advocacy club being started here is reassuring, because I've met so many other students on campus that I didn't know were here who care about the environment and about creation care just as much as I do. And I've been able to share with my friends about my experience at COP and about my love for creation. And they've been really receiving of it, which I was kind of nervous about sharing with them, because it's not something that I've been very vocal about before. But it's been really cool to see how I think the young people of today really care about climate change and about the environment more than we realize. It's just that they don't know how to get involved, and it feels really overwhelming, especially for our generation, because it kind of feels like it's resting on our shoulders to fix this and start to make a difference. So I would say I'm hopeful. I think I've seen things that are making me hopeful and making me realize that the youth of today are more passionate about this than we realize, and that they want to get involved. So that's been really cool to see.
I think that's really important that you pointed out that it's powerful to know that there are other people who care, right? That community is really important if we're going to get anywhere with making change for environmental justice. So I'm happy to hear that. I'll also maybe affirm this podcast that you and Michael have in mind as one of those forces for community. I mean, regardless, you're going to be putting messages out there in ways that actually help people to be encouraged and not to feel alone. So I'm excited for what you guys have in mind, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what's coming. Michael, how has the vision for the podcast shaped up so far, and what are you essentially aiming to do?
That's such a great question, Forrest. And I would say first that I think Kinsley's expressed a lot of the heart behind our podcast. So I'm going to build on that a little bit. Throughout this interview, this conversation with you and James, we've named a number of organizations and people, right? From you two at Circlewood to the Christian Climate Observers Program to the Faith Climate Action Workshop at Westmont. Through those things, we've also met people that run organizations like the Evangelical Environmental Network and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, and the list could go on. There are Christians all around the world that are doing work in this space of creation care and climate action. And yet there's this silo, right? There's this group of conservative Christian college students and young people that just feel like no one else cares about this issue in their community. Catherine Hayhoe has a book called Saving Us. And if you don't know, Catherine Hayhoe's a leading climate scientist who is also very vocal about her Christian faith. And she explains that using dire statistics and warnings to try to make people care about climate change only entrenches them in their fear or disbelief. I was just on a call with her a couple of weeks ago, and she said that the most important thing to do is to connect people's heads with their hearts and their hearts with their hands. And the best way to do that is through story. So as I learned in the class that I teach that Kinsley was a part of, as Kinsley has seen in that class, there are a lot of Christians that care about stewarding God's creation, that look at the exploitation of that creation as something we should not be doing as humans, but they haven't found a Christian community of their own that has made it safe enough for them to talk about it, to ask questions, to feel like they can act in that space. And so the goal of our podcast, Youth and Climate Action, is to speak directly to the conservative Christian young adult who cares about stewarding creation, is worried about climate change, but doesn't know who else they can talk to that feels the same way about it. So in each episode, we'll be having conversations with college students and young adults that have walked the same journey. And we're hoping that their stories will inspire more Christians to come forward with their questions and their worries, and that they will also see the hope we have in Christ, even in the midst of this climate crisis.
Oh, Michael, I love that vision. And I will say from my experience working with Circlewood, we work with a wide variety of people and organizations. Some are faith-based, some are not. And I think that your observation about the silo that certain faith communities, particularly perhaps the more evangelically oriented or conservative, have within them is something that we observe as well. And I love that this is an attempt to not just break into that silo, but recognize that within it, there are so many people that care and maybe haven't had the opportunity to express it and find others. And I love the emphasis on story. And I think, Kinsley, your story is just going to lead the way with that and connect with so many people as you already have in your own community. I love that. And Kinsley, I'm wondering, as you think about the guests you've lined up, the topics, what could a listener expect with the Youth and Climate Action podcast in the coming months?
The guests that we'll be having on the podcast will be other college students and other young adults and youth who, some of them maybe are already pretty involved and know a lot about this issue, and some of them maybe are just getting started. And we just, like Michael was saying, we want them to share their stories and share how they got involved and how maybe they want to get involved, but like we were talking about, they don't have a community to be involved with, or they don't know of anyone else who cares. And so we want to have those guests on and youth on as our guests in order to share with other youth that they're not alone and that this is something that's not so hopeless that you can't get involved, and it's not so overwhelming that you can't start learning more about it and starting to make a difference and taking small steps in that direction. We want to be that community for people who don't have one, and we want them to know that they're not alone and that there's a way to get involved and there's other people who care about this, and that it's okay if you haven't gotten started, because we want to be that first step for them. A lot of people don't know what's the first step I can take to start getting involved, and this podcast is kind of like that first step. It's creating a community for them to start learning more and realizing that there's more people out there who care.
This podcast is already close to our hearts. I'll speak for James as well. As an organization, we're standing behind you completely. We're considering this a Circlewood podcast, and we'll be promoting it and hopefully offering guidance and advice along the way as you guys pioneer this new direction. But I wonder, Michael, if you were to address our listeners, Earthkeepers listeners, how could they support the launch of this podcast and to make it a success?
Thank you, Forrest, for all the support, and James, you as well. We would not be where we are right now without your guidance and your support along the way. And to the Earthkeeper podcast listeners, I would say that we welcome your prayers and positive thoughts, of course. But even more so, we would love it for you to reach out to us if you have a story to tell or can connect us with young people who have stories to tell. Forrest, you just mentioned you have a daughter that's a senior in college at Seattle Pacific. I have a member of my small group who also has a daughter in college who just finished a project doing regenerative gardening. Those are the types of stories we want to capture. So if you work at a university or have a lot of young people in your church, or the parent of one or one yourself, send them our way. And also, we would love it if you would share our podcast with them. It should be live now, Youth and Climate Action. Anywhere you listen to a podcast, you should be able to find it. And so if you think there's someone out there who would benefit from hearing other young people talk about the work that they're doing in creation care and the hopes and worries that they have about climate change, then be sure to share the Youth and Climate Action.
Well, Michael and Kinsley, we usually end our Earthkeepers podcast episodes with some version of the question I'm going to put to you both. What is one way that you are finding hope these days, and one way that's motivating you to keep working on this podcast and keep working for the good of creation? Kinsley, why don't we start with you?
My source of hope these days is just my community and the students I'm surrounded by. Since adding the environmental science minor, I've been able to be surrounded by students on campus who I had never met before and who I didn't even know were here, who cared about the environment as much as I did. And being a part of the environmental advocacy club and getting to have conversations with other youth who are passionate about this issue and who want to see change and who want to make a difference has been so inspiring. And just the fact that we're starting this podcast is also making me very hopeful for the amount of people that we're going to be able to reach and who will be able to make a difference in their lives.
Kinsley, as you were speaking, a word came to mind and I wrote it down in all caps on my pad here, and that was movement. I love that language. That's the language that gives me hope, is that when young people come together and understand that there's this common cause and common concern, I think that's when we're going to see pretty major change, especially from your generation. So I'm glad you used that word too, because I think I'm beginning to sense that emerging. Michael, what about you and how you find hope these days?
I echo Kinsley's sentiments for sure. Being in community with other Christians that care about stewarding God's creation has been honestly life-changing. I would add on top of that my hope is in Christ alone. Christians today so often hear the gospel as two parts, fall and redemption, but ever since the beginning, the gospel has really been four parts. It's been creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. So we were saved by Jesus' death and resurrection so that we can have eternal life, but we were still left here on this earth, which means there's work to be done here. And so that gospel is being able to partner with God in his work to restore, and that fourth part of the gospel story. And so for me, this relieves the pressure surrounding getting it right. It's not humanity's restoration work alone. God is working too. And in fact, he was working first. And so I find hope in knowing that we're not alone in this work.
We've been in conversation with Michael Matchell and Kinsley Rawson about the launch of a new Circlewood podcast called Youth in Climate Action. To learn more about the podcast, go to circlewood.online/climate action. Of course, the podcast can also be accessed through your favorite listening platform like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. And please do forward this episode to any who need to know about the Youth in Climate Action podcast. The Earthkeepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast, or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website, or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest, your podcast host. James Amidon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Meggerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.